We are continuing in our study of the Gospel of John. Last week we considered two things primarily, two sides of the same coin. That Jesus himself is eternal, that is to say, the person of Christ was before man, with God, and is not subject to the effects of time. In an equally true consideration, we saw that he is the same message that God has been saying to man since the beginning. Not that just what Jesus taught or said was what God had for man to hear, but that was Christ himself, his incarnation, his perfect life, his death at the hands of man, and his ever-testifying resurrection to glory from which we now still commune with us. God speaks to us the person of his one and only begotten Son. This is at first a thought that requires some acclamation, that God speaks to us a person and not a word or precept or instruction, but that he speaks his Son. As a side note, I don't intend to tie that off nicely into a compact package you may carry out of here with you. Not only do I not hold that it cannot be done, as though I could relate the totality of someone lesser, say Abraham Lincoln, to you by mere preaching, I also believe that it would cheat you out of the greatest discovery that God has for a man or a woman in his or her life. It is not easily encapsulated, but it is unquestionably true that God speaks Jesus to us. This is something we will continue to see as we go on in John, and I hope that it is a point of great prayer for you if what I am saying is not readily clear. I promise that God will make it so as you seek him. Our study of Jesus continues this week as we consider another characteristic of him. I must take a moment to explain how we are going about this study. I briefly considered art as a beneficial area of study. Very briefly, in the course of a drawing class, we were given an exercise that placed us along the outside perimeter of the classroom with an object placed in the center of the room. The task at hand was to place yourself at any position you desired, possibly the desk closest to you, and to capture with your pencil the object from your vantage point. To ensure that we were able to portray all of the possible facets of the object, let us say it was a vase, we would sketch for 10 or so minutes, and then we'd all shift over one seat in the same direction. We were still viewing the same object. It had not moved or changed, but now we were evaluating it from a slightly different angle. This was not to find that angle that was more or less pleasing to us, or that we were more or less inclined to, as far as personal preference, or that one was more elementary in its composition and easier to capture, but more importantly that we might be able to understand the whole of the object, and to be reminded that while we were considering the particular curve or line of the object directly in front of us, there was in fact a whole object there in the center of the room. So it is for us as we continue on in John. This week we will consider the next thing that John has seen fit for us to know before any event or incident recorded for us. Jesus was God. As I illustrated, we are still viewing the same object, Jesus Christ. We have only moved over one seat, as it were, and are now considering a slightly different perspective. One consideration should also be examined before we continue on this morning. That is the point that we are reading about the characteristics of Jesus Christ before the incarnation. This is very important to note, as today we are examining the fact that he was God. That is not to say he ever stopped being God, but to stress that John is in fact relating to us that this information is given to us with the pre-incarnate aspects of Jesus in mind. We are seeing that Jesus was God, that he was God before he was conceived in Mary and entered into history as a man. Very quickly now, John will transition from the pre-incarnate Son of God to the human person of Jesus of Nazareth. It is simply essential that we see that John is talking in a manner regarding the Son of God that refers to his pre-existence. That is, as a man, his being born in Bethlehem. So, in that sense, we have in the first few verses of John the whole of eternity past, including the creation of the world, man's history up until Christ, and even, in fact, the first 30 or so years of his earthly life. This does not mean that Jesus was not God while here on earth. It means that John is steering us to contemplate that Jesus had a previous existence. And in that, he was God, co-equal, co-existent. That being established, let us begin to consider this actuality that Jesus was God. Again, we are considering Jesus in his pre-human state. But why consider Jesus before? There are two main reasons for us to consider this seemingly familiar fact. The first is transcendence. The first is to prepare us for what John will tell us as we hope to move along with the outline of revelation that the Holy Spirit has given us here, even though we know the end of the book, so to speak, regarding the transcendence of Jesus. By that we mean the great mystery, the fullness of which I do not believe any man has ever grasped in its totality, in which God became man. The incarnation, Emmanuel. I will not go into the actual incarnation of Jesus here this week, but it is my hope that we will give considerable thought to the first condition of incarnation, and that is being God. We'll return to that in a moment. The second reason to consider this facet of Jesus, that he was God, is straightforwardly to give hope. This will be our final consideration today, but I introduce it here so that it may be in mind as we consider the lack of hope, real hope, robust hope, enduring hope in the world today. The world is without God. Now, what did it mean for John to consider that Jesus had been God? As for this first consideration that John gives us, it is here for the very important reason that John is preparing us for what we will come to see in the rest of his gospel, the absolute mystery of God becoming man. As we just said, the reference here is to Christ being God before, in the chronological sense, being man. Jesus was God everywhere that we see or can consider the nature of God revealed to us in the Old Testament. Our goal and our aim here is to come as close as we can to what John's state of mind would have been as this truth of Jesus having been God throughout all of man's history came into its fullness in his life. That is John's life. John was Jewish. He was a Hebrew. That is not a truth without very far-reaching implications. It was not that John chose to be a Jew. It was that he was steeped in Hebrew knowledge, aware of Jewish life, and imbued with considerably more theology than most of us, just given the simple fact that being Hebrew was inseparable from knowing about God. Even the most secular of Jews in his day, and perhaps nowadays, might never enter a synagogue. But just suggest that they were not God's chosen people, and you'd best be prepared for a fight. It was ingrained and absolutely true. But it was the color of the whole of his existence. Much like how one from a foreign culture could study America to great lengths and never quite understand apple pie on the 4th of July. So what of his Jewishness? As you know, God had established his name after a period of life and history on the earth in this way, by calling a man by the name of Abram out of Ur of the Chaldees, back in Genesis. Yes, God spoke to other men before Abram, and would speak to others after him, of course, but Abram, later Abraham, holds a unique place of being the one with whom God would bring about a relationship with a race of people that would last from Abraham onward. God called Abram out of a land of idolatry and paganism, and called him to himself. God called Abram out of all of Abram's familiarity and community and even family, and promised him strength, his provision, and his blessing. It is there for us to consider in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Now the Lord had said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family and your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And in that inaugural communication and revelation of God to Abram, we have all the points regarding the Jewish mindset, such as John's, writing this gospel to us, when one considered God. With Abram, God was the beginning, the Hebrew people, those who would experience life with God. They were also the ones charged with remembering God, not only for themselves, but also for all of humanity. This people, beginning here with Abram and God's call to complete dependence on him, were to be the light of the glory of God on earth. Let's take a moment to reflect on how this unfolded using all of those promises that God made to Abraham and his descendants. As you well know, the only perfect component of any agreement between God and man lay squarely on God's side of the consideration. Just look at this word from God to Abram. Can't you clearly see that the whole bulk of the fulfillment of everything God spoke of, the real hope of it being brought to pass, was an onus on God? Abram had but one requirement, a prerequisite really, one condition to fulfill. Separate yourself. This was God's word to Abram. Give up everything, your home, your surroundings, your ease of life with all the idols, the support of your family, the continuation of your father's name and household. Give it up and let me be everything for you. And this is in fact what God called him to do. These were very real things that Abram was to do. They absolutely affected his life. They were not ideas or theories. Abram took real action in his life and faith and believed God. It may seem as though I've reversed myself here. My argument is that Abram had very little to do with the fulfillment of this great and grand will of God for him. And yet I propose that what God required of him was everything. How can I say that if all the burden falls to God in this arrangement? Do I make light of the hard day when Abram said, "Count me in. I'm leaving this place," and then went off out of everything he knew and everything he'd known, simply following God? When he'd walked away from all the idols that he could hold and make and remake however he wanted, and chose instead to walk with a God who was beyond his comprehension, to depend on him day in and day out, to worship him as the one who was capable of bringing all these wonderful things to pass. And I say the real labor was on God's part. This is how. All that Abram gave up was nothing. It appeared as something, but as he walked away and began to walk with the one true God, he realized that it was in fact nothing. God had not called him to some labor to crush him, but had invited him to know him as the God of all of the universe, the creator of all things. You could never again have told Abram that what he gave up was valuable, or what that God had given him was not a square deal. The king of Sodom tried. He offered to Abraham all that Abram once lived for, and Abram would have none of it. But what of my claim that God had the duty ahead of himself and not Abram? Once Abram had committed with his required separation, which was not in finality that one day when he headed toward Canaan, but over the course of years and decades of obedience followed, God did exactly what he promised he would do for generation after generation after generation. And this thought of God, the God who delivers the people of Abraham out of Egypt, the God who revealed himself in the desert with a pillar of fire by night, the God who enveloped a whole mountain with smoke and lightning in the desert, the God who brought down the walls of Jericho on the seventh day, the God who raised up judges to rescue his people, the God who found and captivated a shepherd boy and then made him king, the God who suffered for years patiently calling his people back from the ways their father Abraham had renounced and walked away from, with all of the idols and all of the vile things, and the God who, seeking to save even some from themselves, destroyed the land he had given them and carried them away for 70 years, and the God who revealed himself just as he had hundreds of years earlier to Abram, revealed himself again to Daniel and Ezra. The God who brought life back to the land promised, Canaan. This is the God John has in mind as he writes. This is his word to us today, that this God, the all-powerful God, the God above all idols, the one true God who is able to keep his promise against any circumstance, the ruler of all, this is the God John knows. And we must remember this. For this is our intent, that all of the things that we know that God did, all of the things he was to Abram and all of the things he was to the Hebrews for centuries, Jesus was God as well in all of it. The power, the majesty, the providence in battle after battle, the preserving force, the holiness that brought the nation to its knees time and time again. John tells us this too was Christ. When we are honest about this and all of its implications, we realize that we are faced with a paradox. Two things are true. One, that God carried out that revelation that he'd given to Abram. He saw it through as God, with power and omniscience and all the control that being bigger than the problem affords. And the paradox of it is this, that in keeping with this unchangeable nature of God, that right along the same line as all of his mighty works, his mightiest of all was to set it aside and come to earth. That the greatest keeping of his promise to be all that would be required of any who would come out from their own land of comfort and idols was that he himself came and died. This is the amazing thing. And the place where we stop in our consideration of God becoming man, with the deep contemplation of God, of his power and otherness, that he was always above man and keeping man and loving man. Let us think long and hard about this, the nature of God. Doing so will bring even more wonder as we look into the great mystery of God becoming man. And that is our point, to consider all that God was up until the coming of Christ. And all of the wonder. For until we do that, him becoming a man, Christ stepping into history and taking on the form of a man, doesn't mean nearly as much as it should. Consider looking through a camera lens. Consider looking through a telephoto camera lens. There's a unique property to those lenses that if you focus them, you can take objects that are seemingly miles away and make them appear only feet from each other. And that is what we are up against in our consideration of God becoming man. We try to shortcut that process. We try to make that a simple step. And we're trying to make God closer and closer to man without it being some large, unthinkable, unfathomable amount of distance. And we're trying to compact that distance, and we're trying to say, oh, God just became a man. There's no real difference there. But there is all of the difference. There is all of the holiness of God. There is all of the power of God. There is all of the presence of God. And we have to consider that. Later on, we'll go on and we'll consider, yes, what it meant for him to become man. But before any of that can have any place of astonishment in our lives, before any of that can really hit us, what really matters is that we remember God. That we remember him, that we consider him as John wants us to consider him, that he was the God of all of the universe, the God of all power. The God who involved himself in history and kept this nation Israel. And he brought them back time and time again. And with power, he saved them. Read the Psalms. Think about the things that those psalmists said about God. And then you come to the end of that psalm and you see their high and their lifted up vision of God, and it's wonderful. And we have to come to that same mindset as considering God, as considering him as he is. And let the wonder of what we're going to look at later, let the wonder of transcendence, of him becoming man hit us, but don't skip over it. We cannot go through that quickly, and we can't make it a small step. It is cheating ourselves. And it dilutes the love and the awe that we should have of God. Consider this long and hard, and almost stop yourself before going into that thought that he became man, coming back and reminding ourselves. The whole world, yes, it's a little children's song, but we would do well to sing it more ourselves. He's got the whole world in his hands. Don't Don't let it become sentimental. Don't let it become poetic. Don't let it become just some kind of grandiose idea. Stop and think about it long and hard until you come to the place where it begins to strain your capacity of understanding that God in such grave danger, and every person and every nation and every people that have sought idolatry. And here's what idolatry is. It is backing away. It is shying away from the grand nature of God. It is backing up from the fact that He is God over everything, and it is unwillingness to submit to that fact. It frightens us. Our man of ourselves, our sinful nature, recoils from that thought. It is fine with having an ethereal God. It is fine with having a God who's just kind of a big man upstairs. But when our soul really begins to contemplate and we begin to become sincere and honest as God always calls us to that one thing, sincerity and honesty before Him, we realize we can do nothing but bow. And that is why we love idols. There's very few that I could think of, possibly here in this Western culture, where we go around and we see an actual carved image. But that is why we love to reduce God to some pocket-sized, clearly spelled out person. Not even a person, an idea, a persona, an ideology. Do anything but let Him be God. Let Him be larger. Let me think about the fact that in His hand is the span of the entire universe. And that 1,000 years go by as a day. And that He was the creator of all things. And that He is actively, presently desiring and longing to know me. That's why we love idols. That's why you love idols. That's why I love idols. I love to take God, and we do it even under the pretense of theology. Let me get all of my doctrine straight. Let me pull out all of my flashcards that tell me the nature of God, and let me reduce Him to a system of cause and effect. If I pray this way, He'll do that. And I don't say that to undermine that there is a right and a proper way, and there's to learn of Christ, and there's to walk with Him. But I say there is a danger there. There is a fearful danger there. And that is why God's command is, don't make an idol out of me. You cannot contain me. I am above all, and you must submit to that. That is the God we have to consider. And that is the place we have to be at. And we need to labor, we need to work, and we need to pray that we would be back at that place of just being in awe and of wonder. And maybe it's the first time for any of us to be in that place of awe and of wonder. Of really considering God and really being honest of how we've boxed Him in and we've compartmentalized Him. And we say, oh, I've got Him completely figured out. It's a subtlety, but would we remove it? Would we go after those subtleties in our heart? And come back and say again, you're God. Think of all the visions that the prophets had of Isaiah. Think of what was in their mind. Think of Daniel, who sought the Lord to see Him and to get a better understanding of Him. Think of Moses on that mountain, face to face with God, in the thundering, in the shaking, in the power, in the darkness, came down with a face that radiated, a face that beamed. He had been in the presence of the glory of God, and it had such an effect that it changed his countenance, and it was just unsettling to all of the Israelites. Of the prophets who had but a vision and but a glimpse of heaven, and upon seeing it, did not say, that's exactly what I thought it would be. Let me get out my sketch pad. Let me get out my chalk, and I'll just do a quick picture right here. No, their word is always, it's undescribable. I come to the end of myself in trying to relate what I beheld. I come to the end of myself. I can't even tell you. And this is what Paul would say about peering beyond everything that we can see here. These are Paul's very words. It's unlawful. There aren't words. I can't describe it. That's my question to you this morning. Is that the God that you serve? Is that the God that John had in mind when he writes this here, seemingly as a little sub-note, as a little afterthought? But if we consider it, this God, the God who when he is beheld silences man and he shuts his mouth, and not in a coming in a forceful way, just if we are to behold him, we can't say a thing. We are undone. All of our theories, all of our theology, all of our speculation, all of our rules and guidelines, all of our religion, in a moment is undone because we behold the living God. And John tells us Jesus was this God. The God. This is the truth. Let us think about that. Let us wrestle with it. And let us come up, because we want to go into it later, let us come up short of beginning to think that God became man. But let us get that first part. Let us understand that side of the equation. Let us really endeavor to come to a place of being in awe of God again, because when we begin to think that he became man, there is the wonder. But what of hope? I said one of the main reasons to even consider these things was that we may have hope in this world. And here it is. Take into account when this world is most hopeless. It's when it's least separated. Do you remember Abram? When did he know the power of God? When did he begin to understand the majesty of God? It wasn't in the Ur of the Chaldees. It wasn't there in the midst of all of civilization. It wasn't there with all the years of tradition, and it wasn't there with all the familiarity of family and of his father's household, and of a clear path ahead of him of how to continue in the world. It wasn't there. He came out and he walked with the living God. And I tell you, today, listen to yourself. Listen to the people around you. Listen to the conversation. Listen to the news. Listen. Stop and listen. This world is so heavy, and this world is so defeated, and people's hearts fail them, and people are in despair because there is no hope. And this is the reason, because the gods that they serve, that this world serves, that you and I so subtly become attracted to, are not the God. They are idols. Is there a wooden statue? Is there a piece of metal that's been fashioned by a workman? Most likely not. Get away from that thought. But there is a containable God. There is a portable God. There is a fully explainable God. And where there is a portable and containable, and I can see every aspect of him, and just like that, I can see the front and the back, and I can understand everything about him. I've got him figured out. Where that is that, there can be no hope. Because you know, and I know, and oh, that this world would know that thing can't save us. That lesser God that impotent God, that lifeless, dumb, mute, deaf God only serves one purpose, and that is to allow me to reign. It leaves me comfortable. It lets me be in control. But the saddest part of that is that the end of all of my resources, the end of my hope, is in fact me. I am on my own. You are on your own if that is the God you worship, and you know it. But if we will put our hope in the living God, if we will realize and confess and freely say, Lord, I thought I had you figured out. I thought I had you boxed in. If we will let God be God, and He always is, it is a matter of our submission to Him. It is a matter of us coming out of all of those things and saying, I have nothing but you are everything. And didn't we see it today? How Jesus was that God. Before ever coming to earth, before ever setting that aside, He was the hope of man. And man, read the Psalms, put his hope and his faith in God, that God would deliver them. And he put his hope and his faith in God, that the death that was around him, that the pain, that the sorrow wouldn't be final, and that it wouldn't get the best of him, that it wouldn't overcome him, that God, the hope beyond, would break through and would act and would save and would comfort and would be everything. That the living God who sees all and who knows all, His eyes, we are told, are roaming to and fro throughout the face of the whole earth, looking to show Himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to Him, is perfect towards Him, is honest towards Him, is yielded to Him. And the greatest parts of that is a heart that lets Him be God. The heart that takes its rightful place of awestruck silence before Him. And dispenses with the theories. And dispenses with the framework that has God all figured out. It says, God, in sincerity and honesty, I'll let you be God. And if we will allow Him, and if we will spend that time in that thought, I tell you, as certainly as anything, as certainly as the sun came up today, that there will again be hope. If we consider this, it only becomes more grand. It only becomes more wonderful if we will return to this place of God being God and us being low and nothing. There is the hope, and there is the great beginning of what we will consider. That God, not some statue, not some ideology, not some myth became man, but the God of all of the universe,